Hello, welcome everyone to Just K. To my subscribers, welcome back. I'm glad to have you. If you're new here, sit back and get comfortable. We're going to talk about everything that is health. This is part 2 of a healthcare disparities video. In part 1, we talked about the organization of healthcare or of medicine and the major roles enslaved people played in that. We discussed the contributions through medical knowledge and torture that enslaved people experienced. Black physicians are still not accepted by white society or the medical associations that have been made by the white society. There's propaganda, this time coming from the North States, for fear of Black people taking over white jobs with the ending of slavery. Today, we're going to start at 1910. I want to take this time to remind you the reason I'm doing this healthcare disparity video is because unless you understand the full history of the United States, you're not going to understand why things are in such turmoil now, including your health. So let's get started. 1910. The American Medical Association is now a powerhouse. They hold their first annual conference with a discussion towards social insurance, or your health insurance that you have now today. They've established a practice for white physicians of being paid, and by the 1920s, I'm going to say, there's a prestige amongst being a white physician, which increases their pay anymore. Now keep in mind, Black physicians are not allowed in this association, so they do not reap the benefits of being paid for their services. They do not reap the benefits of having funding from these other medical societies to go into their work. By 1930, now we're talking about the Depression. So the government kind of shifted its focus and its priorities during the Depression, and it was on elderly care and unemployed people. This is the birth of the Social Security Act, which at that time did not include healthcare insurance. Keep in mind that we're still a segregated society, and this is where redlining comes in. If you remember, I asked you in the last video, what is redlining? And what does redlining have to do with healthcare? Here's where I tell you. Redlining came into play because of a Depression-era act. It's a term, and it comes from policies instituted by Federal Housing Act, and the aim was to reduce the amount of foreclosures going on, during Depression, the Depression era. A thing called the Federal Housing Association was made, and their main job was to determine neighborhoods that were unfit for investment by bankers and other financial institutions. What they did was, on a map, they would outline in red the neighborhoods that were not fit for investment. They would outline in green the neighborhoods that were good for investments, and they would outline in blue the neighborhoods that were kind of in between, the intermediate neighborhoods. Now you remember I just said this is a segregated society. So what does that mean? Well, keep in mind, Black people have also been a victim of this propaganda. All of these things being said, low intelligence, being lazy, all of these things are going to come into play because those red lines on that map were Black neighborhoods. This is important because they couldn't get funding for those neighborhoods, not from their state, not from the government, not from any financial institution, because they were deemed the neighborhood unfit for investment. No new hospitals or clinics were coming in. No new buildings were coming into the neighborhood. Old buildings, if they collapsed, they were just left there. Nothing new was put up or replaced. These neighborhoods just went into steady decline and disrepair, just for lack of funding. Not even small business loans could be made to these neighborhoods. So redlining, it refers to the discriminatory pattern of disinvestment and obstructive lending practices that impede people of color from owning their own homes. I'll probably do a different video on redlining and tie that in differently, but for this purpose, basically what that means is if you were a person of color, you had to live in these areas unless you had an extreme amount of money. If you lived in these areas, you weren't getting the best food, you weren't getting the best medical care, there were no social services to be had for you. That alone, living in that environment alone, affects your health care, and now you take into consideration that there are no clinics coming in to help you, it's pretty serious. By 1932 was the start of the Tuskegee experiment. It was conducted by the United States Health Department in Alabama, and the study was to study the progression of untreated syphilis amongst black men. The men were tricked into thinking they were receiving free health care, even to the point of being offered meals and rides when they got tired of going to the clinic. They were injected unknowingly and without their permission with syphilis. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease with three stages that, if left untreated, will kill you. The symptoms range from fatigue and vision problems to sore throats and dementia. Even though there were bills passed during this time to stop the experimentation on humans, like the Nuremberg Code or the Helsinki Act, the Tuskegee experiment did not stop until 1972. And the reason it stopped in 1972 is only because a man by the name of Peter Buxom leaked information about the experiment to the New York Times. In a Tuskegee Institute, I believe about 242 people died. There were a number of wives who were infected with syphilis. There were even children who contracted congenital syphilis as a result of this experiment. There's another one. Black man named Eb Cade, on March 24th, 1945, was in a car accident, fracturing his arms and legs. On April 10th, while still waiting to be treated for the fractures, he was, without his permission, injected with plutonium, and 15 of his teeth were removed to see the effects of the radiation, plutonium, on his body, all before he was treated for what he was originally in the hospital for. He was finally treated for his fractures on April 15th. So the accident was March 23rd. He had this torture, had radiation injected into his body without his permission. His 15 of his teeth were pulled. Finally, after they got everything they needed, his fractures were treated on April 15th. But the poor man died 8 years later of heart failure as a result of the radiation that was injected into his body. If that's not enough for you, I got another one that you might be familiar with. Henrietta Lack passed away in about 1951 for the unsuccessful treatment of cervical cancer. She was being experimented on without her knowledge or consent, and samples of her tissue were taken and kept studied, ultimately providing us, the medical scientists, with invaluable research and information on cervical cancer. The 1960s, history tells you, is a pivotal time for Black Americans, but healthcare laws, federal laws pertaining to the treatment of Black Americans, such as redlining and all of that, still exist. Nixon creates what we now know as the HMO, Health Maintenance Organization. It was a bid to do other things, but it was knocked down by the American Medical Association at the time. He was trying to do social health care. It was considered communist again. By 1980, we're no longer physically separated, but the same laws are still in existence. The redlining, everything but the knowingly torture of Black people still exists. Only now, big corporations are coming in and taking over the healthcare community with the goal of control, consolidating, and taking over. The Reagan administration has changed the way medication is paid, or the way your treatment is done by. In times past, a doctor was paid by treating a patient. Now they're just paid for giving you a diagnosis. That it was only in 2005 that the Academy of Medicine released a report, and it was documenting their findings that the poverty that Black people are forced to live in alone cannot account for the high rates of death and short lives compared to white people. They found that there was huge differences in healthcare that were inequitable. Older equipment, more conservative medications, slower treatment for heart disease, higher instances of amputation, higher instances of medications that don't work for a particular disease but have long-term side effects. So the torture has changed. Now, instead of putting you on a table and doing horrible things to you, they torture you by trying out medications on you. I finished this history with a little note saying that it wasn't until 2017 that a former president of the American Medical Association apologized to black physicians for them not being allowed in the American Medical Association. But I will say, for my part, this is my plea to you to understand history, understand the role that the laws way back when pertain to you today. You don't have to be a person of color to suffer the disparities today. You could live in a neighborhood that doesn't have the quality health care. You could have an insurance that is a government insurance, and so they give you the lowest form of treatment. Unless you have the money and you are paying out of pocket full-blown cash for your health care, you're suffering a disparity that started with black people and indigenous people and has now grown so rampant that you suffer too. Caring for your health is vital, and there are so many obstacles surrounding us that prevent us from doing that. The healthcare we've taken for granted for so many years, or you've taken for granted. My black behind hasn't. But the healthcare that has been taken for granted for so many years is faulty. The environment we live in has become more toxic as time has gone on. The food we eat has been, the process of making it and putting it together has been sped up to the point that we're basically eating poisons when we ingest our food. All of this has got our minds so filled with so much poison that we're just a sour people now. We have to pull this together. We have to pay attention to our health. We need to move a little, pay attention to what you're putting into your body, watch where your mind goes, and be careful what comes out of your mouth. In my next video, I'm going to tie it in with a few stories to hopefully show you some real-time stories on my personal experiences on healthcare disparities and how that works. I want you to be able to notice and point out when you're not getting the quality of healthcare that you deserve. And I want you to be strong enough and have enough of a voice to speak out against that. Nothing in this world is going to matter if we're all dropping dead in bad health. This is not something that just affects older people or sick people anymore. This affects everybody. Let's take care. Let's pay attention to our health. Let's make sure that we have the information that we need to move forward. That's all for today. I love you guys. I thank you. Hit like, subscribe, and click on that bell for notifications for more health talks, because we will be going in. I thank you, and I'll see you again. Bye.